This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. To discuss Libya and the latest developments across the Middle East and North Africa, we're joined by two guests. Vijay Prashad is Chair in South Asian History and Professor of International Studies at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, author of 11 books, most recently The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World. He opposes the U.S.-led intervention in Libya. And we're joined by Juan Cole, Professor of History at the University of Michigan. His blog, Informed Comment, is online at juancole.com. His most recent book is called Engaging the Muslim World. Professor Cole, you support the U.S.-led intervention in Libya. You wrote about it in a piece called An Open Letter to the Left on Libya. Professor Cole is joining us from Ann Arbor, Michigan. Lay out your argument for intervention, Professor Cole.
Well, intervention is always a problematic thing, and it could go badly wrong, I have to admit, from the outset. But you had a situation in Libya which was pretty peculiar. The uprising was a popular uprising. You had crowds coming out into the streets in downtowns, in Zawiya, in Zuwara, in so many of the cities of that country. In Benghazi, you had very substantial numbers of the officer corps defecting to the crowds, declaring for them. And it was chaotic and it was not well coordinated, but it was nationwide. And I would estimate that at its height, the people had thrown off Gaddafi's rule in something on the order of 80 to 90% of the country. And mostly, it was done nonviolently. And then the Gaddafi sons, who command these special forces, and the tank commanders, made an attempt to put this down. And they did it in the most brutal way possible. They mounted tanks, 30, 40, 50 tanks, sent them into the downtowns of places like Zawiya, and they just shelled civilian crowds, protesters. They shelled buildings. They brutalized people over days until they scared everybody and put them down. And then they sent secret police around to round up alleged ringleaders and reestablish secret police rule. And they did this in town after town after town. And then they started rolling the tanks to the east, and they were on the verge of taking the rebel stronghold, Benghazi. And there certainly would have been a massacre there in the same way that there was in Zawiya, if it hadn't been stopped at the last moment by United Nations allies. And here we had a situation where the Arab League met and demanded a no-fly zone. The U.S. Senate voted a resolution for a no-fly zone. The United Nations Security Council passed a resolution, 1973, asking not only for a no-fly zone, but for all measures necessary to protect civilian life. And now you have NATO and Arab League members like Qatar and the UAE patrolling Libya's skies, intervening against those tanks that were wreaking that havoc on ordinary people. So this is not something that could have been done in most situations. I mean, you were bringing up places like Yemen. Bombing Yemen would produce no result whatsoever, and I don't think anybody has asked for Yemen to be bombed. But in Libya, it made a difference. It saved Benghazi. It saved this popular protest movement, which, by the way, includes so many workers and ordinary people. Some of the cities which have thrown off Gaddafi, like Misrata, were known, for instance, for their steel mill. These are progressive forces who were fighting a wretched secret police regime.
We're also joined by Vijay Prashad. You are opposed to the intervention. Why?
Well, it's a long story, and it should go back to a particular kind of understanding of Libyan history, where Libya, from the Ottoman period, has had a divide between the East and the West. Certainly, Gaddafi, since the 1980s, has been a reactionary leader in Libya. And I have never ever felt, and I've written from the 80s onward, that Gaddafi is on the side of reaction rather than a progressive. So let there be no mistake that what I would like to suggest is not a defense of Gaddafi by any means. On the other hand, there has been a protest movement in the East, as I said, that goes back several decades. Most recently, on February 17th, 2006, there was an uprising in Benghazi. It was put down. And then the anniversary came on February 17th of this year. There was an attempt to revive the protest, taking inspiration from other parts of North Africa and the Gulf. So yes, indeed, there was a popular uprising. It was stronger in the East than in the West, although in working class areas in Tripoli, there was some sporadic rising that was observed in Tajura and other neighborhoods. So that is correct. But very quickly, the French and the United States government came in and attempted to, I think, transform the Arab Spring to their advantage. So, for instance, when we talk about the rebel leadership in Benghazi, one should keep in mind that the two principal military leaders, one of whom was a former interior minister in the Gaddafi regime, and the second gentleman was a general who led troops in Chad in the 1980s and was then taken up with the Libyan National Salvation Front, went off to live in Vienna, Virginia for 30 years, about a 10-minute drive from Langley, and returned to Benghazi to, in a sense, I think, hijack the rebellion on behalf of the forces of reaction. It's very important to recognize, as Juan said quite correctly, that it's Qatar and the UAE and the Gulf, the GCC, the Gulf, Coordination Council, that is behind this, which is the principal Arab support for the humanitarian intervention, as it were. And these are the same places where the same organization which has attempted and has now put down the uprising in Bahrain. You had the Saudi Prince Faisal al-Turki talking about the GCC becoming perhaps a NATO of the Gulf region. So I would like to suggest that, even by February 26th, 27th, when the United Nations first took up the Libyan case, the rebellion was not quite a rebel army as it was in Tahrir Square. It had already been substantially co-opted by the people who were on behalf of NATO and the United States. So the first thing I would say is we should be very careful when we think of the rebels. We should not confuse all the rebellions across the Arab world and consider them all to be the same. There are some important differences. And secondly, the United States and NATO has its own agenda here, and when one supports an intervention, I think one should be very careful to see whose intervention we are supporting. Is this on behalf of those young people, the workers and others with whom we have allegiances and alliances? Is it going to be on their behalf, or is it going to be on behalf of people like Khalifa Haftar, the colonel who has returned from Vienna, Virginia, to lead the troops in Benghazi? So I would just like to say that my sense of dismay at this intervention is precisely because I think it's for the bad side of history, and in some ways it is a measure to clamp down on the Arab Spring, to take attention away as well from Bahrain and other places, rather than a part of the Arab Spring.
Professor Juan Cole, your response.
Well, I just think it's a mistake to characterize a mass movement of millions of people with reference to one or two individuals. And it's simply not the case that this was primarily, or that is to say only, an Eastern uprising. The city of Zawara, which is about the farthest west you can get among major population centers, threw off Gaddafi. Zawiya, which is in the west, threw off Gaddafi. Zintan, a major tribal center of the Zintan tribe, threw off Gaddafi, and Gaddafi's tanks are still trying to take it back. And Misrata, which is a western city, a major western city of nearly 600,000, threw off Gaddafi. So the East-West divide is a non-starter here. The West also didn't want Gaddafi. I would suggest that much of Tripoli didn't want him, and especially the working class districts, Souq al-Juma and others, as was mentioned. So this was a very widely based, geographically and class-wise, widely based uprising. That there are one or two individuals that you can name who came back to Benghazi and declared themselves leaders is irrelevant. We don't know what the leadership will look like going forward. There are also, allegations that some of the fighters had fought U.S. troops in Iraq and are quote-unquote al-Qaeda. There's this tendency to try to take one or two individuals and use them as a proxy to stereotype this uprising. It's just the youth of Libya. It's the youth of Benghazi and often city notables and workers' unions and so forth. It's just the people. And you're going to have all kinds of people there, and some of them are criminals, and some of them might have a terrorist past, and some of them might be hooked up with the CIA. I don't know. But you can't use that as a stereotype for the whole movement and say, therefore, it's all right if these people are massacred with tank and artillery shells as they stand peacefully in the center of a city square like that of Benghazi.